Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Lieutenant Deadeye asked me to make a video about voluntarism, and I think it's a topic that's worth a scripted video. But of course those take a long time, so it's going to be a while. I've also got other things in the pipeline right now. So I wanted to just make a quick video talking about voluntarism, because it's an interesting subject, and a very problematic one historically. So, very briefly, the idea of voluntarism is that the primary attribute of God is his will, not his intellect. And this really comes out primarily in morality. It's got some other implications, but that's where we most often meet it, and where it sort of causes its most appreciable mischief. So the idea basically is that there is no ability to, it is not possible for human beings to understand morality. It doesn't make any rational sense. It's simply a list of things that we must do because God has willed it to be so. That's the basic concept of voluntarism. You see this in the later medieval period with, to some degree, Duns Scotus and, well, I'm not clear exactly how much he was into it, and William of Ockham. That dark name. But anyway, okay, voluntarism, in this sense, it poses several real problems. One of which is that, basically it just means turn off your brain, stop thinking, and do. Which more or less puts us in the category of animals. It's a rejection, essentially, of reason. And what becomes especially a problem within a Christian context for this is that human beings were made in the image of God. We are, you can see this in several different ways. It describes us in Genesis as being made in the image of God. But you can also see this in the incarnation of Christ, that God took on flesh. He joined a human nature to his divine nature in the person of the Son. But he didn't do this with, say, a caterpillar, because a caterpillar is not, or at least, this very strongly suggests, a caterpillar's nature is not compatible in the same way that our nature is compatible, because we are an image of God. Now, image, of course, not in the sense of, like, take a photo and, it looks superficially similar, especially in 2D projections, but rather an image of God in the sense of we bear some similarity to God, in particular in our rational intellect. That a turtle is not an image of God in the same way that we are an image of God, because we are rational animals. We are capable of understanding. And in fact, this is why we can understand the world, because our intellect is an image of the intellect which made the world. Therefore, the rational idea according to which the world was created and ordered is understandable to us precisely because we have rational minds created in the image that made the world. Voluntarism, of course, throws all that out. It's impossible to understand. And it's basically a rejection, therefore, not just of thinking, but in being a rejection of thinking. I'm oversimplifying slightly, but not really, frankly, very much. Voluntarists, I think, would generally object a little bit to that, but they don't really have good ground to stand on in that objection. So the thing is, it is a rejection. Voluntarism, in essence, is a rejection of us being an image of God. It is an attempt to put so much distance between us that that we're just so completely and utterly unlike God, not even, analogically like God in any way whatsoever, that it becomes impossible essentially you also wind up with it being impossible for us to think about God. But again, sort of the side point, the bigger point is this essentially goes directly against the concept of the incarnation. You also find voluntarism, by the way, it's a common strain of thought within Islam, a fairly dominant one. I believe it's Al-Ghazali who more or less won that battle. And most Islamic philosophers ever after have been voluntarists. And it's more compatible with Islam because you don't have anything incarnational in Islam. That in Islam, man is nothing like God. Man is just, dust, a slave. God, within Islam does not love man. Man is simply the slave of God. And hence, you can see submission. Whereas in Christianity, you have the incarnation. God took on flesh to raise up our nature. And then you can see, actually, again in the discourse, where Jesus said to his disciples, I do not call you slaves, for a slave does not know what his master is doing. Instead, I call you friends, because I have revealed to you everything that the Father has given me to reveal. Quote from memory, and I'm kind of tired, so I apologize. That's not a perfect quote. But the basics are correct there. That Christ elevated us from the status of slaves to the status of friends. And that's really where, within a Christian context, voluntarism becomes completely untenable. It's iffy, frankly, in a Jewish context, precisely because the Torah states that we were made in the image of God. And if you really go the voluntarist route, you have to deny that. You have to deny that those words actually mean anything. And that, of course, is how voluntarism tends to work, because you can consistently deny all meaning, and no one can raise an objection because you can simply deny the meaning of the question that they are, the objection that they are in fact raising. So you can throw up your hands and say, can't think about it. And they'll say, but what about, and you say, can't think about it. They'll say, well, but on the other hand, can't think about it. And you can consistently do that. You know, like like a Teddy Ruxpin. Actually, he didn't work by the pull string, but like one of those pull string toys, or like a new atheist on Twitter. You can just say the same thing over and over and over again, no matter what the input is. The thing the other person has said is, and it works. I mean, it's consistent. You haven't said anything that you are also contradicting, because you are simply refusing to do any thinking. And it is, but that's effectively what voluntarism is. So if you're going to do any thinking whatsoever, you have contradicted voluntarism, and clearly you don't actually really believe in it. I'm very iffy on the degree to which anyone really does or has ever believed in voluntarism. Voluntarism in general seems like more like a defense against certain types of problems than anything anyone has ever consistently thought, precisely because voluntarism is basically directly anti-Christian. It is a rejection of that similarity that exists between God and man, and as such it is exactly contrary to the meaning of the incarnation, the concept of apotheosis. That saying from the patristics that God became man, that man might become God. Not literally become God, obviously, but rather be raised up and conjoined into God to the degree that our finite natures permit such a thing. Obviously, we don't become infinite. We don't become uncreated or anything like that. That's sheer nonsense. But to the degree that with the obvious provisos given our nature and logical non-contradiction, that idea that God has elevated us to become like him, that we are sons by adoption, as St. Paul put it. So that's basically the problem with voluntarism when you get down to it. It's sort of the heart of voluntarism. It's a big subject. I intend to address it more, but really at the end of the day, that's the problem. And you can see this even if it's less the philosophical version and more the simple, outright moral version of don't try to understand the rules, just follow them. It's that exact same rejection of reason, which is a rejection of humanity being the image of God, which is effectively a rejection of the incarnation. So, I'm not trying to speak for other Abrahamic faiths or other religions, but within Christianity, voluntarism is simply not compatible, not even close to compatible with Christianity, until you modify it sufficiently, because there is one asterisk, and this is where, I know people who respect Duns Scotus, and this is why I don't know precisely what he taught, because you could, as a sort of out, hook into the fact that there really isn't as big a distinction between the will and the intellect as we tend to make out. That is to say that since the will has to move towards something apprehended by the intellect, you can't have will without intellect, and you can't will something that is not apprehended in the intellect. A blind striking out, it doesn't even mean anything. Really, at the end of the day, you can sort of, take physical metaphors, but if you try to actually say what you mean, you can't within that idea, that a will cannot exist independently of an intellect, and similarly an intellect can't exist independently of a will, because it can't actually effectively look at anything. You couldn't have a purely passive intellect that was incapable of doing anything, because it would not. I'm not putting this rigorously, obviously, but it wouldn't be an intellect, basically. So, because the intellect and the will are not really nearly as separable as we tend to make them out, though they are distinguishable, their inseparability means that if you are officially voluntarist, you might not be in the sense I've been talking about voluntarism. If you recognize the interrelationship of will and intellect, such that that when you talk about God's will, you are not actually talking about that as if it was something separate from the intellect, and therefore that God willed it is, referring rather to the rational natures that we've been given, such that this is in no way a denial of the fact that we can actually understand it. So I don't know what Scotus taught. I'm just saying there is that possibility. So I want to be careful there not to accidentally malign him. So just holding up, not only the thing, but the possibility, one possibility at least. He could have meant something else too. People you don't read can mean lots of things. So there, in a nutshell, is the problem with voluntarism, at least as it is commonly understood and one commonly meets it. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.